Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Demai. We're up to Perek Dal Mishnah Bet. The Mishnah says, Hamadir et chavero sheochal etzlo. If somebody invites a person to join him for a wedding meal for a newly married couple, and he makes a vow that his friend, the one he invited, should accept the invitation and eat by him, he says, if you don't come, I'm making a vow that you will be forbidden to have any benefit from my possessions. And he, the invited person, does not trust the host regarding Ma'asrot because the host is an Am Haaretz and the one who's invited is a Chaver. He's trusted that he doesn't eat Demai produce. The Mishnah says, he may eat with him at the feast that takes place on the first Shabbat after the wedding, even though he doesn't trust the host regarding Ma'asrot. But he may only do so provided that the host tells him the food is tied. Even though generally we don't believe on Me'aratzot, in this case the Chachamim allowed you to rely on his testimony and eat that food on Shabbat, because if you refuse to participate in the feast, it will cause hatred between the host and his friend that he invited. Now, the Mefarshim do point out that the Chachamim only allow this leniency for the feast that takes place on Shabbat. If the feast takes place on the weekday, it's not as important as Shabbat, therefore there won't be that much hatred between them if he declines the invitation. Likewise, the Chachamim did not allow you to rely on the Am Haaretz's word on Shabbat, because since he invited you Erev Shabbat, in order to be able to rely on the Am Haaretz's word, it has to be that you asked him on Shabbat, like we spoke about in yesterday's Mishnah. But the Mishnah continues, Uba Shabbat Shniyah, at the feast that takes place on the second Shabbat after the wedding, because the Mefarshim point out that if you look in the Gemara Masechet Ketubot on page 8a, you'll see that they used to make feasts in honor of the bride and groom for up to 30 days after the wedding. So on the feast that takes place on the second Shabbat after the wedding, even if the host makes a vow that the person who he invited, if he does not show up, he cannot have any benefit from him. He may not eat the food until he removes the tithes. And the Mefarshim explain, because even though the wedding celebration is continuing after the first Shabbat, the invited person's presence is not as important, and therefore it's no longer a concern of hatred if he denies the invitation. Therefore, the Chachamim say you're not allowed to eat the Am Haaretz's produce. You're not allowed to rely on his testimony that he tithed it. You're only allowed to eat it after you tithe it yourself. That is the end, Rabotai, Mishnah Bet. Now, Rabotai, Mishnah Gimel is going to discuss several differences between Tevel, which is produce that you did not remove Ma'asrot, you did not remove it for sure, and Demai, which is a doubt, you bought produce from Am Haaretz, you don't know if it was removed or not. One of the differences is Maaser Rishon. Maaser Rishon of Tevel, of produce that nothing was removed, must be given physically to a Levi. Not only do you have to designate it verbally and say this 10% is going to be Maaser Rishon, you have to actually physically give it to a Levi. Maaser Rishon by Demai, you have to verbally designate it. You say this 10% is Maaser Rishon, but you do not have to physically give it to the Levi. And the Mefarshim explain why. Maaser Rishon you have to designate from Demai, because we don't know whether the Am Haaretz did it or not. So we have to verbally designate it to remove the Tevel prohibition. You don't have to actually separate it and give it to a Levi in order to remove the prohibition. It's enough to designate it. Once the Maaser Rishon has been designated, the rest of the produce becomes mutar, and even the Maaser Rishon itself becomes mutar, because anybody can eat it. Once it's designated, once Terumat Maaser is given to the Kohen, anyone's able to eat it. The only question you have left is if the Leviim have a claim to say that this portion has to be given to them. And since it's a monetary claim, the rule is Hamotzi mechavero alav haraya. If you want to take something out of your friend's hands, you have to prove that it's yours. And since the Leviim cannot prove that it's theirs here, they don't know if Maaser Rishon was given by the Am Haaretz, they cannot claim the food. And therefore the owner designates it verbally, and he's able to keep it by Demai. He doesn't have to physically separate it from the remainder of the produce. However, Rabotai, the Mefarshim do point out that after you designate the Maaser Rishon, you have to designate and physically separate the Terumat Maaser, the 10% of that's given to the Kohen, which is 1% of the crop. You cannot just verbally designate the Terumat Maaser without separating it, because Terumat Maaser is prohibited to a non-Kohen like regular Terumah. And the halacha is that even if it gets stuck in a mixture, and you don't know where it is, you're not allowed to eat the entire mixture, you have to give it to a Kohen. So since there's an obligation to separate it regardless, Chachamim say you must give it to a Kohen. Another difference is that Maaser Sheni, you have to designate from Demai, but you don't have to actually separate it, because you can redeem the coins, same thing onto coins in Yerushalayim. The Mishnah now is going to discuss how you designate or separate Maaser Ani from Demai. Maaser Ani replaces Maaser Sheni on the 3rd and 6th year cycle. Rabbi Eliezer says, En Adam tzich likrot shem lemaaser ani shel Demai. Rabbi Eliezer says that one does not even have to designate by name Maaser Ani of Demai, meaning not only do you not have to separate Maaser Ani from Demai, but you don't even have to designate it by name to remove the Tevel prohibition according to Rabbi Eliezer. Why? He says we assume the Amaris designates Maaser Ani, even though he doesn't designate the other tithes. And the Mefarshim explain, Maaser Ani has no sanctity. Anybody's able to eat it. The only legal requirement you have is to give it to the poor. So in this case, the Amarit says, I'll separate it, meaning I'll designate it in order to remove the Tevel status so that now I can eat it. He'll keep it, eat it himself. Why? He says, I'm not stealing from the poor. It never came to their hands. It's still in my hands. So I'll designate it verbally to remove the prohibition, but I won't give it to them. He's not going to do this by Maaser Rishon. That's one of the reasons why we have to separate Maaser Rishon by Demai. The Amaretz will not do that. Why? Because he thinks once you separate Maaser Rishon, you have to give the Terumad Maaser to the Kohen, and which is Amaretz is afraid to eat because he knows it's Terumah. So because of that, he won't separate it. Likewise, he's not going to separate Maaser Sheni because he doesn't want to have the burden of having to redeem it or eat in Yerushalayim. So Rabbi Eliezer says he separates Maaser Ani and then he keeps it for himself, so you don't even have to designate it verbally. And again, the poor person has no claim that you have to give it to him because again, but the sages agree with the Rabbi Eliezer. They say Koreh Shem, you have to designate it verbally in order to remove the prohibition from the produce of Tevel, but you don't have to actually physically separate it from the rest of the produce. You can keep it because again, once the Maaser Ani, is separated verbally, you remove the prohibition of Tevel from the rest of the produce. The only problem you have left is the monetary law of giving it to the poor people. And again, since they have no proof that it wasn't already given to them, the Maaser Ani, they cannot claim it. They have to bring proof. Therefore, since they cannot have it, obviously I'm going to be able to keep it. And the Chachamim, their logic with Rabbi Eliezer is like this. They don't agree with Rabbi Eliezer. They say Rabbi Eliezer holds Amei Aratzot designating Maaser Ani. They separate it and then they keep it for themselves. Chachamim, first of all, they disagree. They say no, the Amei Aratzot do not separate the Maaser Ani. They don't designate it. However, even in your world, Rabbi Eliezer, that they do designate it, why not remove any doubt at all by designating it again? At least designate it by name and remove any doubt. And this way you'll remove any possible Teven status. The Chachamim, like we said, obviously they hold themselves that Amei Aratzot do not designate Maaser Ani, so you have to do it midin. But even according to the Rabbi Eliezer that you claim they do, what does he lose out? Designate it verbally, you're going to keep it anyways because they have no proof that it's theirs. That is the end of today's Mishna Yomi, Rabotai. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen v'Amen.